Hey friends, welcome back. So in today's video, we're going to talk more about how fasting impacts cortisol. I've read many of your comments. There's been so many questions about, well, isn't fasting a stressor, but doesn't fasting raise cortisol? How does cortisol impact my sleep? We're going to break down and talk a little bit more about that and review a recent paper from PhD researchers who did a systematic review all about fasting studies and what the data shows with regards to how fasting impacts cortisol, how fasting impacts insulin, how fasting impacts autophagy. But since there's so many questions and concerns specifically around how fasting impacts cortisol, I really want to hone in on that because we live in a stressful environment and fasting is yet another stressor. So hopefully by the end of watching this video, you'll have a better understanding about how fasting impacts cortisol, the natural cortisol rhythms, and what is the best feeding fasting strategy to support hormonal health. So let's talk a little bit more about that. Now, I think we just need to realize that cortisol has a diurnal rhythm. Okay, this is called the cortisol awakening response. What I'm going to put here is CAR, for cortisol awakening response. It's important to recognize that you want cortisol to be increased in the morning, but low before you go to bed. So here's cortisol here, here's time, we'll put time here, here's the morning. So as you wake up, you want a strong cortisol rhythm and you want it to go down before you go to bed. Okay, you want cortisol to increase here. And what's important to recognize, what these researchers did in a very recent systematic review to PhD students, they found that out of 10 studies that have specifically looked at how fasting impacts cortisol, 4 studies showed that it had no impact on cortisol. 5 studies showed that it actually did increase cortisol slightly. 1 study showed that fasting increased cortisol in the morning, but actually decreased it in the evening. So when you hear a lot of people say, oh, you shouldn't fast because of cortisol, the data actually doesn't totally support the fact that fasting is terrible for increasing cortisol. Again, 4 studies showed no effect. 5 studies show a small increase. 1 study showed it supported what you want the rhythm to do. So that's why I'm a bigger fan of time-restricted feeding. The way that fasting can be problematic is if you do intermittent fasting and you have your last meal right before you go to bed. Because when you eat food, okay, I know this is unpopular to talk about, but eating in and of itself raises cortisol. It's a counter-regulatory hormone. So when people say, oh, if you have adrenal issues, you should never fast, well, the same argument could be said, if you have adrenal issues, you should never eat, which of course is not possible, it's not feasible. We need to eat food, so we need to recognize that the rhythm we don't want when it comes to cortisol is you don't want it to be low in the morning and high at night, okay? Now, how would this inverted rhythm happen? From being on your cell phone at night, from going to bed and having, sleep-wake, social jet lag, so going to bed at different times, from fasting all day and having your big bolus meal right before you go to bed, because that can increase your cortisol before you go to bed. So this is problematic, okay? Now, that's why I'm a bigger fan of early time-restricted feeding, which there's actually 2 studies in here that the scientists talk about, I'll share with you on the screen, that have found that time-restricted feeding supported the natural diurnal rhythm of cortisol that we're desiring. So it's still fasting between 16 and 18 hours you could do as an early time-restricted feeding, but you're eating earlier in the day and you're starting your fast in the early evening as opposed to fasting all day and breaking your fast in the evening. That can compromise your sleep, and I'll share with you some inverted sleep profiles here and why you really should consider time-restricted feeding if you're worried about the cortisol response. But first, friends, I want to welcome you back. Thank you for being here. It's Mike Mutzel. If you're enjoying the content, please hit that like button, share this video, and also because we're talking about cortisol. We know we're in stressful times with inflation, with potentially a recession coming. I've really been managing my stress by incorporating breathwork and meditation and doing yoga and all sorts of vocal releases with open.com. This is an awesome library that has live access to classes where you can get literally live tutorials on how to do breathwork, how to do vocal releases, how to incorporate yogic breathing, and some sort of breathwork that I do before I film these videos to ensure that I'm breathing properly to vocalize content for you. And so I know in your business, in your life, you can benefit from managing your stress and mindset and learning breathwork and meditation and much more. So you can get a 30-day free trial with open.com/HIH. You can get unlimited access to live and on-demand classes to learn about breathwork, about mindset, about meditation, yoga, and much more. I can tell you these live classes are phenomenal. If you join with people all over the world to learn how to do breathwork, what breathwork is, breathwork strategies to improve sleep, which we're about to talk to, breathwork strategies to awaken your body in the morning. So again, check it out, withopen.com/HIH and get a 30-day free trial, because sleep is important, my friends. So I start my day with breathwork. Here's why, okay? We talked about the diurnal rhythm that you want to have and how early time-restricted feeding can support that, how the garden variety intermittent fasting and having a big bolus meal before you go to bed can augment or impact that. But this is what you want to have for optimal sleep. You want low cortisol levels in the PM. It's basically, we're drawing the inverse here. And you want high cortisol levels at night, okay? So this is gonna be time, okay, on this axis, and this is gonna be cortisol levels. Now, for supporting sleep, what one study showed, I'll share the study on the screen. This was in elderly people who reported greater sleep quality, feeling more refreshed in the morning. They have low cortisol at night and high cortisol in the morning, okay? So again, we need to get away from this idea that cortisol is always bad, that cortisol is something that we should decrease. You want it to be high in the morning, okay? So the greater the difference here between the PM cortisol and the AM cortisol was independently and statistically significantly linked with sleep quality. This is important. So you might say, okay, I want to be more like this person. I want low cortisol in the PM, high cortisol in the morning. How do I do that? Okay, that's eating earlier in the day. That's starting your fast earlier in the day. That's not getting on screens in the evening time. That's ensuring that your retina, that you're seeing sun in the morning and you're seeing darkness in the evening, okay? So this is what we want. It's not that we want to suppress cortisol. It's not that we want to eat in such a way that totally drops cortisol on the floor. We want to support the body's natural diurnal rhythm. We can do that by managing our stress. We can do that by manipulating our feeding window. So in sum, okay, a lot of people actually, I'll draw a different color here so that we can see this. A lot of folks are going to bed with high cortisol and waking up with low cortisol. And they're blaming intermittent fasting for impacting their cortisol. It's not the intermittent fasting, my friends. It's being on screens. It's going to bed at 2 in the morning some nights, going to bed at 10 the other nights. It's having a TV in the bedroom. It's not managing your stress, which you can help to do by going to With Open. There's all sorts of different things we need to consider. So let's not totally blame fasting for some of this. It's also exercising close to bedtime. So this is why exercising in the morning can help support this cortisol awakening response by getting up, going outside, seeing the natural sunlight, moving the body, getting the body awakened, doing a cold plunge in the morning. We know cold plunges can temporarily increase cortisol awakening response. So I thought this was really important, is understanding this diurnal rhythm and not blaming fasting. So as the scientists say here, fasting and time-restricted feeding have a positive effect on insulin sensitivity, on increasing autophagy, and have the potential to be an intervention to reverse diabetes and insulin resistance. But they say that fasting is a form of stressor that puts the body in an energy deficit that can also have deleterious effects in the body the same way that other stressors do. So it's important that we focus on a sustainable way of fasting for general health and understand the interplay between fasting as a beneficial stressor, not as a detrimental stressor, okay? So again, the detrimental stressor happens here when we're fasting all day and having a bolus meal before we go to bed. And actually what this study, and some of those studies I mentioned, there was like 5 studies that show that fasting does increase cortisol. Many of those studies have been in individuals who are participating in Ramadan fasting. We know that during the month of Ramadan, what they'll do is they'll fast all day when the sun is out and eat in darkness. And so what that can be doing is skewing the cortisol awakening response, skewing that rhythm, impacting some of the cortisol differences between the PM and the AM. And so again, that's why I'm a much bigger fan of early time-restricted feeding. Those studies have shown that time-restricted feeding increases the pathways linked with longevity, suppressing mTOR, increasing autophagy, and decreasing IGF-1 and some of those different attributes and much more. So I just think if we can find an eating modality that supports the cortisol awakening response and the diurnal rhythms, that's going to be favorable, and that's what the studies show. So in conclusion, the data doesn't overwhelmingly suggest that fasting completely jacks up cortisol. The data just doesn't show that. Like I said, 4 studies show it doesn't do anything. 5 studies show it does increase it. 1 study shows it actually decreases it. So it's, when people say that, I have clients who say, oh my gosh, I did this, the Dutch test, or I did this adrenal stress response test, and my cortisol came back low, so therefore I'm gonna stop fasting. It's like, well, you should get the TV out of the bedroom. You should get off your iPhone at night. You should make sure in the morning you're getting out and getting daylight. Let's do all that stuff before we start to blame fasting, because again, eating raises cortisol, right? I mean, there's a study, again, a scientist here at University of Washington has studied this extensively. A lot of people don't know about that. So I'm not saying fasting is the cure-all. I'm not saying that it can't be another stressor for people who are already psychologically and physiologically stressed, but we can't always blame cortisol for our poor circadian rhythm and sleep hygiene and light. So hopefully that helps to explain things, and hopefully these data sets help just give you more research so that you can customize the feeding fasting window and feeding window compression plans that optimize your life and much more. So again, thank you for supporting our show sponsor, withopen.com/HIH. Thank you for hitting that like button, and hopefully you enjoyed this video and found some value, and also enjoyed some of the research that I'll link below. And with that, friends, we'll catch you on a future video down the road. Bye now.